Welcome back to week 2 of Ease into Impact. I'm Christina Marie Anderson Anstead, and I'm a brand strategist and web designer who helps speakers and storytellers become easily bookable and stand out online. Ease into Impact is my subtle nod to call bullshit on the new year, new me attitude and help speakers like you have an even more impactful 2025 and even more successful 2025 by focusing on the real things that you can change about your brand and your website to spread your message and show up uniquely as you head into this new year. If you watched week 1 of Ease into Impact, you will be intimately familiar with the fact that if you are a professional speaker, then you are your brand. So naturally, as an extension of that, your brand should encompass you and it should resonate in everything that you do and everywhere that you're showing up, from LinkedIn to virtual summits to your website and to other forms of social media, as well as all of the marketing collateral, whether that's digital or print, that you're putting out in relation to your business. Now, that's all well and good, but let's talk about the essence of a brand, because it's one thing to say that you are your brand, which is true, but how do you encapsulate that? So, as I was making notes for today's video, I wrote down this definition of how I would define what a brand is. I wrote down that a brand is the colors, fonts, iconography, imagery, and voice that you use to create an experience out of your story. What this means is every touch point, again, colors, fonts, iconography, imagery across all of the places that you're showing up should have a cohesive feel. And what we want to do is we want to make you memorable through cohesion. I was just talking to a professional speaker yesterday. He's been at it for about 4 years now, and he's got some things going on that are doing really well for him. But he's realized that not everything matches the energy that he brings to LinkedIn. So, what we talked about yesterday, and I love that he used this word, was bringing congruence to all of the channels where he is showing up. So if you have a favorite channel where you're showing up, whether that's online, in person, etc., that is really the basis for how to build out your brand. What are the ways that you're showing up there that really feel exciting to you? And how can we capture those things to make sure that you have a cohesive, congruent brand that you can use everywhere that you're showing up? And that's where we come back to the colors, the fonts, the imagery, and once you have those set in stone, you can start to disseminate them in all of those places that you are in order that when they go to your website, it still feels like you and it feels like it resonates with the human being, the real human being that you are when you show up in person at networking events or even for a coffee chat with your friends, but also on stage or in front of larger audiences. You want all of those things to match. That is the essence of a brand. That is what a brand is. So now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into each of those individual aspects so that you can understand what actual design files and color codes, etc., that you need to ensure that you actually have an established brand. Let's get started by talking about your brand color palette. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see not just speakers make, but business owners of all kinds make is they think that one or two colors paired with the colors black and white is a color palette. And I am here to tell you very clearly that that is not enough. Black and white, for very technical reasons, should honestly never be included in a color palette. Never is a very strong word. There are instances where they work, but black and white should not be two of the main colors in your brand color palette. So when I talk about your brand color palette, I'm looking for 5 to 7 colors And what we want these colors to do is we want them to work well together. And we also want them to be an expression of you and your personality. So, in terms of working well together, what I mean by this is we want an accessibility tested color palette. This means that the color palette has enough colors of varying contrasts that you can layer the colors on top of each other for easy readability. Now, this takes into account not just your average reader, but it also takes into account folks who may have some sort of sight disability that would cause them to need higher contrast than average. There are standards, the WCAG standards, and there are different ways to go about checking your accessibility of your color palette. But know that this is an important step in establishing a color palette is making sure that there is a variety of colors that have enough contrast that they can be used together. Secondary to that, again, variety of colors. 5 to 7 colors might feel like a lot, but you wanna have your big, bold colors that are the hallmark of your brand. The one that's coming to mind right now is Walmart because Walmart just did a slight rebrand, and they've got that bright blue as well as their yellow logo, and those are pretty hallmark of Walmart. Amazon's got the blue smile, and now I'm also going a little bit into the iconography category here, but when you think of a brand, the color that they use most often is something that you should think of. And the same thing goes for you as a professional speaker. So, on that note, when you're building a color palette for your speaking business, for yourself as a professional speaker, or as an author, or as a podcast host, in a lot of ways, these colors should be very resonant with you. And one of the things that's a little bit different about professional speakers is that the colors that and not just the colors, but really the whole experience of your brand. It's not just about standing out to your audience or resonating with your audience. It's about capturing your personality and the experience of who you are, because that's what's going to make you stand out to your audience, but to those event planners, speaker bureaus, and decision makers who have the final say in whether you're moving forward, whether you're being chosen for this event or that event. So, an easy place for professional speakers to start with their color palette is to look at their wardrobe. What colors, or is there a color that you always show up on stage in? Additionally, what colors in your closet light you up? Which ones do you put on and feel like an absolute million bucks? And the reason that I'm talking about your wardrobe here is because your brand color palette isn't just for digital media. It's not just for social media or your website. It's not just for print media, but it really extends to all of the places that you are showing up. So this is going to look like the clothing that you wear on stage. It's going to look like the book covers for the future books that I know you're going to write. It's also going to look like potentially the stage lighting that's behind you when you are on a virtual call or a virtual screen like this one. And even when you are on a stage at a larger event. If you have the ability to ask for different colors of stage lighting, you can absolutely incorporate a color into your palette that just makes you feel confident on stage. So, in thinking about your brand color palette, it's about capturing the essence of you and what lights you up, which again is a little bit different from a traditional brand, where a traditional brand is more focused on resonating with their audience because it feels like what they want. And a professional speaker is more interested in standing out and expressing themselves as an experience. That is where the color palette comes into all of these different aspects of how your brand and how you are showing up as your brand in all of those different places. Next up, I want to talk about your brand font choices. Now, as a self proclaimed font nerd, I do understand typography nerd. I do understand that I am more likely, perhaps much more likely than your average human being to be able to A, identify fonts, but B, notice font usage and see how it's interacting with the other parts of a brand. That being said, I truly believe that having a font that you use everywhere that you show up and potentially choosing a pro font, a licensed font that not everybody has access to, is one of the easiest ways to create memorability and transform your brand into something that feels fully fledged. So, when you're thinking about the fonts for your brand, I would urge you not to just choose whatever top 10 Google font you happen to like this week, but really think about what kind of font feels like you. There are ways to understand what types of fonts will resonate with your brand and will feel like part of your experience. So, for example, if you're an incredibly playful person, you might want to search for playful fonts. If you're a playful person, you probably don't want serif fonts. Serif fonts feel a lot more traditional, a little bit harsher, and they don't typically fall under the playful realm. However, if you are really corporate, you're like a buttoned up speaker and like you speak to corporate audiences and that is how you embody yourself, a serif font, something more traditional, is going to make sense for you. So, when thinking about your fonts, I would urge you to dig a little bit deeper than what just pops up on the free Google Fonts repository and really think about what words embody your personality and search for fonts that also embody those same words. The other thing that's so important, and one of the biggest mistakes I see when it comes to fonts, is when you choose a font, stick with that font. Don't just create a new document and start using whatever font is in there. Try to stay consistent. And again, this is going to lend itself to that memorability through cohesion thing that we are trying really hard to do with our brand. Is everywhere that we show up, we want to show up in the same way so that people can say, oh, that's so and so. Oh, that's her. Oh, I remember seeing her there. Oh, I've got her business card in my wallet. Let me give her a call. Do people do give her a call? Let me shoot her an email. Let me scan the QR code. That's probably a little bit less millennial for you. Oh, but that's the thing. Choosing the right font can truly transform how you're showing up and add an extra dimension on top of that color palette that you're going to be using everywhere. If your fonts on your PowerPoint slideshows and your one pager and your speaker reel and your website and your business card are the same in all of those places, it's going to lend itself very, very well to becoming more memorable. The other thing that I always suggest, and this is, you would call this like, because this is something that I'm saying because of the digital landscape, the world that we live in. I always make sure that my clients have a font, a paid licensed font, which means that fewer people are going to have it, that they can connect with their brand and use in their brand graphics, etc. But there are plenty of places online where you're not going to have the ability to upload a custom font. And typically these days, because Google is all knowing, their fonts are typically available in all of the different places that you're going to be showing up, whether that's on Canva or in your website or using InDesign on your computer or your designer is using InDesign. They're going to have access to a free Google font. So I always want to make sure that my clients have a custom font, a licensed font that feels like them, as well as a free Google font. And now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Google fonts these days. So you don't have to use Montserrat or Lato or Railway or Poppins. You can really dig down into, or we together, if you're looking for a typography nerd to help you with this, we can dig down into the different types of fonts that are available and really find something that's A, unique, and B, feels like you. You may have noticed that I haven't actually talked about your logo yet. And this was intentional. You have heard time and time again that your brand is more than a logo. And I'm here to reiterate it. That is absolutely true. Your brand is so much more than a logo. I would argue that the colors and the fonts that you use are much more important than your logo. And let me tell you why. Your logo is only going to show up so many places. When you show up on stage, you don't have a little digital logo sitting on top of your head that shows people who you are. So if your logo is the only thing that you have established for your brand, you don't have a brand yet. And that's okay. That's what this video is for. But the iconography, and I'm including logos under the umbrella of the iconography that you use for your brand, is only going to show up in so many places. And your brand, as a professional speaker specifically, needs to encapsulate all of who you are. And you can't do that with a logo, especially a typographical logo, because many professional speakers are going to have a logo that only says their name. It's not going to include anything else about them other than fonts and colors. So when you're thinking about your brand, your logo is not the most important thing. It honestly shouldn't even be the first thing that you think about. The logo is a culmination of how the rest of these pieces fit together, but it is not the most important part of your brand. And if you take anything else away from today's video, that's what I want you to think about, is how your logo is not as important as some of these other pieces that really help establish you and show that experience of who you are and what it's going to be like to work with you. So under this iconography umbrella, we have logos, but we also have icons as well as patterns, as well as any other like hand-drawn or even purchased asset that mostly lives in a print or digital sense. Those are not things that you can bring into your real life. You can't make them tangible in the sense of carrying them on stage with you or anything like that. But they're going to play a large role in things like your social media graphics, your website, your one pager, your speaking reel, the PowerPoint slides that you use on stage. The little touches, the arrows, the symbols, your logos, yes, of course, in all of its different forms, because you don't just need one logo, you really need two or three. You also, a submark, something that is sort of a condensed version of your logo that can be used, a condensed or simpler version of your logo that can be used in some of those less obvious places, or in places like your proposals or your invoices, for example, where a full logo doesn't make sense. That's the iconography that I'm talking about. So it's all of those, let's call them like line art. That is not the right word, but I'm not talking about photos. That is a separate topic. I'm going to move on to that one next. But we're really talking about those digital assets that you can input, drop them in here, there, and another place, that combined with your fonts, the fonts that you use everywhere you show up, and your colors, the ones that you use everywhere you show up, are going to start to create this cohesive brand, is an encapsulation of you and the experience that you bring to the table when you show up on stage, in person, etc. I'm giving imagery its own category, but I also do feel like this is sort of an addendum to the iconography category. It's a slightly different umbrella, but it is very similar. So imagery means the actual photos that you use with and associate with your brand. And for most professional speakers, I would always encourage that you do a brand photo shoot. There are some speakers out there that do an incredible job of capturing themselves in their brand photo shoots, or of having their photographers capture them in their brand photo shoots. And I'd be more than happy to give you some examples so that you can learn a little bit more about what kind of photos you need for your website, your social media, your one pager, your speaker reel, etc. On top of professional brand photos or brand photography, the other thing that you're going to need is professional photos of you on stage. And I say professional photos of you on stage very particularly, very specifically, because having some iPhone shots that your friend in the audience took is not going to be enough. It doesn't lend that credibility factor. They're never cropped correctly. They're incredibly difficult to use in a high resolution capacity, especially on your website. So the two types of photography that you will likely need to invest in are going to be brand photography and professional photography of you speaking at events. Secondary to that would be videography. Speakers need a speaker reel. And in order to create a speaker reel, you have to have professional footage of you showing up on stage. Now, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. If you're just starting out, put it together how you can. What you can do now is better than if you wait to be able to pay for all of these things. So start now with what you have. And when you're ready, know that professional brand photography, professional photography of you on stage, professional videography of you on stage are going to be incredibly important to not just establish your brand, but to truly establish yourself as a professional speaker and show up in a way that's going to help you book more engagements, whether that's lead generation through LinkedIn or social media or your website. Those professional pieces are really going to make a difference in the credibility factor. Now, there's also some imagery that you likely won't have to pay for, and that's going to be things like stock photos. There are different places you could get stock photos, but they're stock photos. And you can use stock photography to enhance what you already have established for your brand. The professional brand photography that you use is going to be great, but there are times where you're going to need to evoke a feeling about your brand. And sometimes that requires using photos of inanimate objects. I'm a very big plant person. So you're always going to find plants in the imagery that I'm using, whether that's my professional photography that I've had done, whether it's the background here on my virtual stage. There's always going to be plants. And these are a really easy way, like using plant stock photography for me is a really easy way to extend the imagery that you already have while continuing to encapsulate who you are and the experience of what it's like to work with you. So, for example, I recently worked with a client who has his signature talk, The Purple Goldfish. His original book is The Purple Goldfish. And he had some beautiful imagery where there was a background of what looked like purple fish swimming behind him. That's a background that could be used in multiple different ways throughout his brand and throughout his website and throughout his media in order to continue this thread of the purple goldfish. And that's really what it is. It's continuing the thread wherever you show up, in whatever way you're showing up. And that's where imagery plays a role in your brand.
We're almost through this. So, this is the second to last piece of the puzzle. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because last week I spoke in depth on this topic. But the last piece here that I want to talk about before I get to the penultimate, what's really important here is your tone of voice as part of your brand. Your tone of voice, the way that you speak, is an inherent part of how you show up as a professional speaker or an author or a podcast host. The way that you talk, the words that you use, the cadence of your speech, all of those are incredibly important pieces of the tone of voice for your brand. So it's important to understand how you talk and how you show up in real life and as your real self. Because remember, we want to make it so easy to be undeniably you. We want you and the way that you show up to be memorable through cohesion. And I mention that again here because what I find a lot of the time with professional speakers is you may come from a corporate world. It's kind of the same coin. You either came from the corporate world, so you feel like you have to speak like the corporate world, or you didn't come from the corporate world, like myself, and you feel like you have to live up to the standards of the corporate world. In neither of those scenarios have you left room for your own personality and the way that you show up. So your tone of voice doesn't have to be all buttoned up with a tie on. And, that, like, if that's who you are, use that as your tone of voice, embrace that as your tone of voice. But if that's not who you are, then the experience of you and of your brand is not going to be served by using that type of voice. And one really easy way that you can understand more about your tone of voice, if you're interested in using as a brand strategist, copywriter, and web designer in the year 2025, I know is important for any brand. You can feed some of your content, whether that be a transcript from a call or personal emails that you've written to friends, and feed that into ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your AI of choice, and ask it what the hallmarks are of your personal tone of voice. And then you want to note those hallmarks of your voice and make sure that all of the content that you're putting out match up with how you actually talk, especially as a professional speaker, especially as an author, especially as a podcast host. It's going to be so important that the way you sound on stage is the same way that people hear you speak when they're reading your written content on LinkedIn. So if you want more information about how to understand your tone of voice, go back to last week's video, week 1 of Ease into Impact, and take a look at the tone of voice section, where you'll learn a lot more about how to encapsulate your tone of voice and the ways that you speak and the ways that you don't speak in order that you can use that voice everywhere that you're showing up. At this point, I've spoken about all of those very tangible aspects of your brand. And some of you may be thinking, holy shit, I don't have a brand. And some of you may be thinking, okay, I think I have all those pieces, but why isn't it resonating? Why isn't it showing through when I'm showing up online? And the most important piece, more important than your colors, your fonts, your logos, your iconography, your imagery, or your tone of voice, is understanding how to use all of these pieces in harmony everywhere that you're showing up. And for many people, many businesses, this is going to look like brand guidelines. Brand guidelines are, of course, all different brand strategists, brand designers do their brand guidelines differently. But the overarching theme is it tells you how to use your brand and how not to use your brand. So, for example, if you've got those accessibility checked colors, but you don't actually know which ones should be laid on top of other ones, and instead you choose 2 of your darkest colors and put them together, or 2 of your lightest colors and put them together, that is not going to live up to the brand that has been created for you or that you've created yourself. So having brand guidelines, understanding what type of logo to use where, what type of colors to use where, how to take your colors from digital to print media, how to adjust your colors so that you can get a stage lighting color behind you that resonates with the brand that you've created, how to pick out clothes that have similar colors to what's in your brand palette, and understanding how to utilize all of those different pieces so that when you're showing up, it's not just cohesive, but it looks good too. That's part of the experience, right? You don't show up on stage in a rumpled t-shirt and flip-flops and your bedhead. I'm assuming. If you do, more power to you. I doubt you do. The digital equivalent of that is using your color palette wrong, your font hierarchy wrong, your imagery wrong, etc. So it's not just important to have all of those pieces. The most important part of it is understanding how all of those pieces truly fit together and work together in harmony, whether it's you building social media graphics or your designer building your speaker, making sure that it's clear how all of those different pieces of your brand should be used together where you're showing up to create a cohesive and memorable feeling about the experience of what it's like to work with you. So now you might be asking yourself whether you're one of those holy shit, I don't have a brand people, or whether you're one of those I think I have all of this people. Right now, you're probably asking yourself, like, what do I do with this information? So, the impactful step that you can take right now, today, sit down 20 minutes, 30 minutes, is audit your brand. Do you have an accessibility checked color palette, 5 to 7 color palette that actually really resonates with the experience of you? Do you have font choices picked out, and do you know how to use them, where to use them, and what type of font to use in what scenario? Do you have a logo? And also, do you have a logo in all of the forms that you need it, which would typically be a horizontal logo, a stacked logo, potentially a circle logo, as well as those submarks and any additional patterns or icons that resonate with your brand and help having brand photography and visuals that truly resonate with who you are and that truly portray who you are to the audiences that you are sharing those images with, whether that's on your social media, in your one pager, on your website, etc. So take a minute, take a beat, and sit down and really think through the assets that you have for your brand and understand if you have a brand or not. There is a clear answer. You either do have all of these things or you don't have all of these things. And if you don't have all of these things, don't worry. Start to accumulate them. Start to think about what it looks like to get some professional photos taken when you're on stage, to book a brand photo shoot, to create a logo that truly encapsulates you, to understand what accessibility looks like in a color palette, and, one step at a time. But the first step here is to audit your brand, take 10 minutes, 20 minutes today, sit down with a piece of paper and say, checklist, do I have these things? Yes or no? And that's what I want you to take away today. You don't have to worry once you've completed your audit. I'm here if you need me, but there are plenty of resources for you to find out there so that you can start to gather these pieces of your brand so that you feel like you have something really cohesive that makes you memorable and that makes you stand out. Going back to what we talked about last week, your personality, bringing that through in every single piece of collateral that you put out there in every single place that you're showing up. And the last thing that I want to do is I want to thank you so much for showing up for week 2 of Ease into Impact so that I can help you feel more confident and have a more successful 2025 in your professional speaking business. It's truly an honor to be able to help educate you on these things. And next week, I'm going to be talking about one of the hallmarks of what I help my clients do, which is becoming easily bookable. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have a website, or I'm not ready to think about my website, so that video is not for me. And I want to stop you right there because, yes, I am a web designer and a web developer. That is the cornerstone of my business. I do it for speakers and storytellers just like you. But I also understand that there are other ways in which you can make yourself easily bookable. My background is in luxury client experience. So one one of the first things that I learned is the answer is never no. The answer is let me see what I can figure out. And being resourceful is how I built my business, and it's how I'm going to teach you to be easily bookable, whether or not you have a website, whether or not you're ready for that. There are other tools that we can use. So please tune in again next week for week 3 of Ease into Impact so that you can have an even more successful 2025 in your professional speaking business. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.